It's monsoon season in Pakistan, which isn't all bad. As the seasonal winds shift and the hot, humid air rolls in, the rain that comes with it can bring vital irrigation to crops and stock up aquifers for the rest of the year. But when you combine those winds with things like melting nearby glaciers and more frequent rain caused by climate change, the results can be devastating, like what happened in 2022.
Tonight, catastrophic flash flooding wreaking havoc in Pakistan.
That's when over a third of Pakistan was underwater.
This climate change-induced disaster has been months in the making, in what the UN has referred to as a monsoon on steroids.
At the time, the world was still riding the wave of 2020's wildfires, riots, and pandemic. And a lot of folks were feeling pretty not great. They called it yet another sign of our impending doom.
Climate change is now rapid, widespread, and intensifying. That is according to a devastating report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warns a code red for humanity.
Records were shattered again and again. A reminder that we are now in uncharted territory.
And they weren't exactly wrong. In fact, they probably didn't even feel that way because of 2020. Because really, any given day, if you take a stroll around social media, you'll find lots of folks who are pretty convinced that the world is ending.
Here are 3 more events that would end the world. Number 1, Jupiter turns into a star.
NASA warns of an internet apocalypse that could disable the internet for everyone on Earth.
I'm a time traveler from the year 2045. Whether you believe it or not, I'm here to warn you of the zombie apocalypse that has already begun.
When news of a disaster seems to roll in every day, it can feel like there's little hope. But what if we had another option? Not just to reverse course on climate change, but to set the course for a better future. I'm Lacey Healy, and today on Things That Go Boom, we ask what a working feminist foreign policy might actually look like and how it might help us roll back the end of the world.
Sometimes things in the world of technology are complicated and need careful explaining. Sometimes they just need a little hard truth.
I don't think anyone is going to buy a banana with crypto at any point in the foreseeable future.
I'm Lizzie O'Leary, the host of Slate's What Next TBD, your clear-eyed guide to technology, power, and the future. Friday and Sunday, wherever you get your podcasts.
In October 2000, the UN Security Council did something radical. For the first time, it enshrined the essential role of women in not just achieving, but maintaining peace.
The Security Council chamber used to look like a gentleman's club, with women relegated to largely menial roles. This is a sight you now see much more often at the United Nations. 2 male aides and a female ambassador.
It's had a real focus on protecting women from the harms of war, trying to increase the participation of women in peace building, all sorts of ways of trying to mainstream gender into how the international community responds to violent conflict and peace building after war.
Claire Duncanson has been working to analyze and improve the agenda ever since, along with her colleague Cohn. Both are luminaries in the field of gender studies. Claire at the University of Edinburgh, and Carol at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And just having the chance to talk to them was a big deal for the little nuclear nerd still living inside me. The nerd that's read Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals more times than she can count. But this time we weren't here to talk about that article. We were here to talk about saving the world. Because Claire and Carol told me that in those years that they studied the women, peace, and security agenda, they came to realize something.
We found that the things that we were looking at, which included the deepening of inequalities after war instead of the transformation of them, or the deepening of environmental devastation after war rather than improvement of the environment, the greater loss of livelihoods instead of providing new livelihoods, that the causes of those things were the same causes as the causes of our planetary climate and ecological crises. All of the things that not only make wars happen, but also means that even in peacetime, people's lives aren't peaceful.
They realize that people just can't flourish when the environment around them doesn't flourish.
I was reading just the other day about in the Antarctica that there'd been this 38-degree spike in temperature compared to the seasonal average in the coldest place in the world.
And there has been an extraordinary heat wave, the most extreme heat wave the planet has seen in recorded history.
Now, scientists have warned that the planet's natural refrigerator, the Antarctic, could begin acting as a radiator, warming.
Scientists are saying, we don't even know what the ramifications of that will be. But we do know that if Antarctica heats up and the ice sheets and the glaciers melt, we're talking about sea level rise coming sooner than scientists had previously thought. And we need to remember that 40% of the world's population lives within 100k of coastlines. So this is, massive.
But it's also just one of the multiple crises we're facing today.
One American ecoacoustic scientist, he's got a 55-year archive of these sounds of the forest or the water in the creek or the birds singing. And he reckons now that of his 55-year archive, 70% of the habitats that he was recording now don't exist anymore.
So when Claire and Carol started looking around at the state of the world, they started to find the women, peace, and security agenda lacking.
So it's just these devastating ecological dynamics, I think, that we need to have uppermost in our minds. And when you think about them, you start thinking, well, is women's representation in foreign ministries the route that's going to get us to really address these huge challenges that the world now faces? And I guess we're a bit sceptical that that's the route to taking them.
Up to this point, countries that have implemented feminist foreign policies have largely fallen victim to a misstep that many diversity initiatives do, focusing too closely on just representation. It's a strategy the Women, Peace, and Security agenda also leans heavily on, just getting more women in the room, at the expense of other factors that might bring real change.
Women's representation is important, but I think it's this emphasis governments place on measurement has maybe led us to call for the things that we might not necessarily have put front and centre.
I think most people, when they hear the word feminist, the question that they think you're asking is essentially who is being included and who is being excluded, right? Are women here or aren't they here? Are women being heard or aren't they being heard? But feminist approaches ask another question as well, which is what is missing? What is being excluded? What isn't being paid attention to or being valued or thought important?
Let's not maybe think so much about the 3 R's, the rights, representation, resources, but rather step back and say what are the biggest challenges facing the world today and how can a feminist approach get us thinking about how to do things totally differently? How can we rethink the very idea of national interest?
The idea that GDP growth, for example, should be the goal of economic life, that military solutions are superior to diplomatic ones, or that technology should get more focus than ecology when it comes to climate change.
At this point, it would take an economic miracle to achieve the 3.2% growth rate for the full year predicted in the president's budget.
The Commerce Department said today that GDP grew at a 5% annual rate last quarter.
This made for a very chipper day on Wall Street.
Businesses are looking at ways to save money, and they may have found that with smart technology.
Now, Bill Gates, he thinks we need to leverage technology and innovation to rapidly lower emissions.
It's that kind of thinking that got us into the mess that we're in. It's led to colonial and neo-colonial extraction of wealth from the global south, the extraction of resources and human labor.
An approach that's been underwritten, says Claire, by militarism.
Which has led to massive violence and suffering, but also to the climate crisis. We need to remember that the US military is the largest institutional contributor to greenhouse gas emissions.
Emissions that the U.S. pushed to keep out of reporting requirements contained in both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, meaning that we don't even have a full grasp on how huge the U.S. military's climate impact might be.
So if we don't just assume that people's lives will be made better by strong militaries and a strong GDP showing in our economic success, but rather say, okay, what would directly make people's lives more secure? And how do we construct economies that directly focus on achieving that? People need decent livelihoods, food, access to water and energy. They need community. They need a sense that life is fair. That's what really makes people feel secure.
We should be using feminist approaches to rethink the very goals, the very purposes of foreign policy altogether. Don't just talk about state security. Actually ask, are humans within the state secure?
Carol told me about Guatemala's decades-long civil war, when Mayan women in northern Guatemala were subject to sexual violence at the hands of the military.
The defendants were given the maximum sentence, 30 years each, for crimes against humanity. The women were treated like animals, the judges said.
And it is exactly that kind of sexual violence in war that the Women, Peace and Security agenda arose up in opposition to.
According to the United Nations, nearly 45% of Guatemalan women have suffered some kind of violence in their lifetime.
And so then you imagine, okay, you have women at the peace table. In the peace agreement, you guarantee women certain kinds of political rights.
Rights like Guatemala's 1996 promise to allow greater access to and return land to certain groups, including rural and indigenous communities.
So in Guatemala, these things happened, the war ended, there were certain kinds of rights for women and indigenous women guaranteed. And then 30 years later, Mayan women in those same northern indigenous villages were being the victims of sexual violence again. And this time, they were being raped by the Guatemalan military, but also the civil police and private military contractors, all at the behest of the Guatemalan Nickel Company, which wanted access to the land that those villagers were on. So you have to say, what is the impact of this sort of national political rights approach? And you guarantee women, you formally guarantee them, let's say, the right to land when there are transnational economic actors who want access to that land.
Carol says that time and time again, we see that women's lives are more affected by transnational forces that can't be prevented with a state guarantee, both economic forces and ecological forces.
So I'll give you just one other example. Let's say, again, women have access to land. Let's say this is along the Mekong River. Women are engaged in rice cultivation. But what's happening more and more in the Mekong is that due to sea level rise, due to the depletion of underwater aquifers and land subsidence, the river is becoming more and more salinated further and further up the river. And that salinization prevents the rice cultivation, right? You can't grow rice plants in salty water. So what is the good of land rights in that scenario? So I think that's the thing that overwhelmingly we see again and again, is that women's rights per se does not protect women, right? Can't protect women.
So what can protect women? That's after the break. Do you remember that time that Condoleezza Rice wore those boots? It was 4 years after 9/11, and the then Secretary of State was traveling with George W. Bush to Germany, hoping to strengthen American ties with NATO for the ongoing war on terror. Shoulders straight and head held high, Condi walked out onto the stage at Wiesbaden Army Airfield. She was wearing a long black coat with these smart gold buttons. And they were buttons that tracked just to her hips, allowing the long length of her coat to blow open as she walked. And as she did, scandal. Condi was wearing a pair of knee-high black leather stiletto boots. Okay, nobody was angry exactly, but the boots did warrant their own write-up in the Washington Post. And today they've become lore among many women working in Washington, because as Robin Given noted in the Washington Post at the time, this look was so rare. It was a look that laughed in the face of Washington's established, sensible norm, one of many norms that roam the halls in Washington. Carol Cohn says that institutions like those in Washington are not just places where men, and historically white men, exercise power.
Because if that's all they were, then you could put women in those institutions and they could exercise power differently and everything would be cool. But institutions are produced by and produce and reproduce specific systems of power relations, specific kinds of privilege. And they do that not only by who is allowed to sit in them, but by their institutional cultures, what they value, what they take seriously, what kind of speech and argument and inputs are seen as expert or inexpert. So institutions are not neutral, and they're certainly not gender neutral. They are places where power is produced and reproduced.
What this means is that even after you add more women to a workplace, any workplace, those women have to adapt to the institutional culture in order to be taken seriously.
So when we move into and try to have an impact in institutions, we have to adopt their language, their values, their ways of measuring. We have to accept what it is that they consider relevant and important if we want to be heard. And when we do that, we are then, in a sense, censoring ourselves. We are then agreeing not to talk about certain things. You don't go into the Security Council as a woman or as anybody else and talk about militarization as a problem.
As a result, women often limit the kind of inputs and expertise that they allow themselves to offer in these spaces, which ultimately limits the kind of impact they can have in their work. Carol says that this is one reason that she really doesn't blame states for focusing so much on representation.
That is what you see happening when women say, okay, let's count how many women are actually in this peacekeeping force, or how many women go through a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. Or when green jobs are being developed, how many of them go to women?
It's easier to count how many women are in the room than it is to change the fundamental way a place works, and always has, even when that way is wrong. And on top of that, Claire told us that even when governments get past representation and start taking feminist action, they can get tripped up by corporate pushback.
It takes bold governments who are willing to take on corporations. And we know that that's hugely challenging. We know that when things like windfall taxes were suggested for fossil fuel companies, how much that's resisted. And we know that corporations will use the opportunity to move their headquarters if they feel that they are being penalized.
She says that states have to work together internationally because it's too easy for private industry to get around a single government.
So one suggestion comes from Mia Motley in Barbados, who has suggested that I think it's 10 cents in every dollar of profit that the fossil fuel companies make be redirected to a loss and damage fund, so to go directly to Global South countries who have done least to cause the crisis but are suffering first and most.
International agreements like this one proposed by the Prime Minister of Barbados also have more potential to correct global injustices that are at odds with a truly feminist foreign policy.
Inherent in where we are is an understanding both that the climate and ecological crises have been produced by the northern industrialized West, and yet the countries that will pay the most in consequences are poor countries in the global South.
Some global South feminists in particular talk about this as an ecological debt, which isn't just about forgiving a country's debt because it can't afford to pay it. It's about how the U.S. and other countries have extracted resources from the global South for years. And now
we owe them.
It's another shift that a working feminist foreign policy would need to reconcile. But Carol says that the global North also has to stop causing harm.
So, for example, supporting large-scale mineral extraction or agro-industrial production of palm oil in the global South, or destroying the Amazon to produce hamburger meat for McDonald's, stop doing that and support agroecology projects that are locally democratically controlled, where you have smallholder multi-crop farming that works ecologically and doesn't rely on fossil fuels and doesn't produce these greenhouse gas emissions.
Which might sound impossible, but according to Carol and Claire, we have no choice.
We have to try to tackle the entrenched excessive consumption in the global North, to work for climate reparations, to work for systemic reform and transformation, to work for a paradigm shift in how we understand the relationship of humans to the rest of the living world and what that means about the purpose of economic life.
These are the paradigm shifts that feminist foreign policies are trying to achieve, prioritizing human security and conflict prevention over military and corporate interests.
And that may seem politically impossible, but the alternative is that we keep on extracting fossil fuels and other natural resources while also thinking that we're somehow going to prevent ecological collapse. That doesn't just seem impossible, that is actually biophysically impossible. So we've got to go with the option that only seems politically impossible.
Whatever its challenges, a change as drastic as feminist foreign policy might be our only way out. In our next episode on Things That Go Boom.
And for me, I would really look to those global networks who claim to be doing a lot of peace work. Where are you with the women of this region? We've been challenging them, but they are not forthcoming. So we need to make sure that women realize that women need each other in times of war, even in times of peace.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you like what we do, you can find more at inkstickmedia.com or on social at inkstickmedia. And don't forget to leave us a review if you haven't already. This episode was produced by Robin Lynn and edited by Nikki Galtland. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. Thanks as always to the supporters and the foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you all in 2 weeks.
This parasite that started the apocalypse is so bad that it's out here already killing your children's children. It's costing your relationships. It's costing your finances. It's hurting you and you don't even know it because you just been.
From PRX.